Are you having child support issues? Stay with us today, where I'll be joined by John Schuman of Devry Frank, who's here to explain everything we need to know about child support. Welcome back to Real Estate 101. Today we're going to continue our discussion on family law and talk a little bit about child support. And I'm pleased to be joined once again by John Schuman of Devry Frank LLP. John, welcome back to the show.
It's good to be here.
So John, I want to start today's show and talk about child support. And a lot of people seem to be having some trouble with it. And I want to ask you, is it really that complicated?
Well, for about 15 years now, we've had these things called the Child Support Guidelines. And the Child Support Guidelines simplified support and divided into two sections: base child support, which is entirely based on income, and special expenses.
Okay.
Little extras.
Okay, now who has to pay the base child support?
Well, anyone who is a parent has to pay child support. And so that always means the biological parents. Biological parents always pay child support, unless the child's been adopted. After that, anyone else who has acted as a parent can also pay child support. So that means step-parents can also be on the hook for child support. And multiple step-parents could be on the hook for child support if they've all acted as a parent for the child.
Okay, so let's say one child lives with one parent and the other children live with the other parent. What happens in this case?
Well, when that happens, it gets a little bit more complicated, but not really. When a parent still pays child support, or the base child support, based on his or her income for the children that are in the other parent's care,
right,
and the other parent pays base child support based on his or her income to the first parent, for the children in their care. It doesn't actually work out that they both write checks. There's a calculation, they work out who has the bigger child support obligation, and the one who pays slightly more writes out a check for a lesser amount to the other one.
Okay, now, is child support payments always, is it calculated, I guess, based on the income on the tax return?
Well, the way the table support, the base support, you can look up. So if you have an income, it's you look at the number for your income on the tables, and you go across the number of children, and you see this is what your child support obligation is. But for some people, especially self-employed people or people who get their money from other than employment, then their total income on their tax return may not be their income for child support purposes. And it can actually be a big difference, because people who are self-employed, they earn income in a lot of ways, and they can have their income structured in such a way that they pay less tax.
Right, okay.
Like there's special incentives for small businesses, and there's also things that are not taxable to people who have their own businesses.
Okay, so what about step-parents? Do they always have to pay the full amount in the tables?
They often have to pay the full amount in the tables, but they're not required to pay the full amount in the tables in every case. Biological parents always pay the full amount, and the other parents who's on the birth certificate, they always pay the full amount. Step-parents don't always pay the full amount, but they may have to pay the full amount. And the way that's determined, and it can be hard to predict in advance, is what child support is necessary to keep the children in the same sort of lifestyle as they had when the parent and the step-parent were still together.
Okay, so what about secondary expenses? Are there any added for special or extraordinary expenses involved in child support?
Yeah, that's the second part of child support, the special and extraordinary expenses. And there are special expenses and there are extraordinary expenses, and they're all shared by the parents, everyone who's paying child support, in addition to the child support payments. They're not included in the child support payments. And they're shared in proportion to everyone's income. And special expenses are expenses that are really necessary for the children, but they're big. So they're often uninsured medical expenses. They are always daycare expenses that are necessary for a parent to either pursue education or to have a job. And they are special needs, special education expenses that are not otherwise covered. These are the things that absolutely the child needs. Extraordinary expenses are expenses that are often the little extras that everyone wants their child to do, but some people can't afford. So hockey, especially things like rep hockey, those are always extraordinary expenses because they are very expensive. Some things are not always extraordinary expenses. So for people who don't make a lot of money, swimming lessons may be an extraordinary expense because it's big proportion of their income.
Right.
But for people who are making millions of dollars, being on a swim team at a national level, paying $10,000, $15,000 a year may not be an extraordinary expense because it's not really big for their income. So those ones can be a little bit harder, but it's always important to talk to a lawyer about these ones because it sounds weird, and the law is very clear on this, but there's lots and lots of cases that say what an extraordinary expense is and what it's not. And if you ask an experienced family law lawyer, they can tell you off the top of their head whether it is or it's not. But if you try to figure it out yourself, it might be a little bit tricky.
Okay, so we've talked about expenses. Now I want to ask you is, when does child support end? Does it end when a child reaches the age of 18?
It can, but it often doesn't. Children, especially now, remain dependent over the age of 18. And so there are two occasions when a child can still receive child support over the age of 18. Good excuses. And those excuses are, one, because the child is sick or disabled and they can't get independent, they can't get their own job. And that's a pretty easy one to figure out. And the second one is post-secondary education. And so if a child continues to be dependent because they are in school and they're working towards a career, then child support continues. Now, people often ask, how does child support continue, and do I have to still pay the same amount? And that depends on the circumstances, especially with children who are away at school, because then the away at school costs are part of those special expenses I talked about earlier.
Right.
So if you're paying for a child to live away at home and paying their residence, you don't necessarily have to pay for the other parent to still buy them the food. So special expenses may cut off some of the support. Now the parent who's receiving support is still maintaining a home for that child to come back from, so there's some support payable, but not the full amount of support payable.
Right.
If the child is still at home and going to school in town and coming back home at the end of every day, then child support is not going to change too much, except that you're going to start sharing those post-secondary education expenses as you would any other special expense.
Right. Okay, so for today's final question, let's say a parent doesn't want to pay child support. Can they just quit their job?
No, they can't just quit their job. Courts, judges don't like it when you do that, and they don't like parents who willfully don't support their children. And just quitting your job or quitting a good paying job to go to a crappy job are things that judges don't like. So if you are voluntarily unemployed or you're voluntarily underemployed, that means you're making less than you should be making, then the court will say, well, you should still be making what you were before, and you're going to pay support as if you're still making that same amount of money.
Even though you may be making less?
Making much less, almost nothing. And if you don't make the payments because you don't have the money, the support's still going to be enforced, and you can still lose your driver's license, still be thrown in jail for not paying child support.
All right, John, good stuff. Thanks for coming on today's show.
Thank you for having me again.
If anybody has any more questions or needs the help of a top family lawyer, they can get in contact with John Schuman at Devry Smith Frank LLP. I'm your host, Joe Terceira. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.